When you look at the British royal family, you're supposed to see something ancient, timeless, and deeply unmistakably British. The crowns, the castles, the accents so sharp they could cut glass. A monarchy that feels as native to the British Isles as rain, queues, and complaining about the weather. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one puts on the postcards. The current British royal family is not British in the way you think it is. In fact, if we're being honest, their bloodline is about as British as a bratwurst. Because for the last 300 years, the throne of Great Britain has been occupied not by an old English dynasty, but by a family of Germans who pulled off the single most successful rebranding campaign in political history. And the wildest part? They didn't conquer Britain with armies, they inherited it by accident. To understand how this happened, you have to understand just how catastrophically unlucky Britain was in the late 17th century. This was not a good era to be alive, let alone in charge. England had just endured the Great Plague, which killed tens of thousands, followed almost immediately by the Great Fire of London, which burned the heart of the capital to the ground. Then came a civil war so brutal and unprecedented that it ended with something Europe hadn't seen in centuries, the execution of a reigning king by his own parliament. For a while, England didn't even have a monarchy. It experimented with republicanism, military rule, and a whole lot of chaos. And when the monarchy finally returned, everyone was exhausted, traumatized, and desperate for stability. Unfortunately for Britain, stability was immediately threatened by one thing: religion, specifically Catholicism. King James II, the restored monarch, decided that maybe England had overreacted to Catholicism and that being friends with the Pope again wasn't the end of the world. Parliament disagreed, violently. What followed was the Glorious Revolution, which sounds peaceful but absolutely was not. James II was deposed and fled into exile, and Britain made itself a solemn promise: never again would a Catholic sit on the British throne. This rule was written directly into law, hard-coded into the monarchy itself. Religion wasn't just belief anymore, it was a constitutional requirement. This brings us to Queen Anne, Britain's first monarch after England and Scotland officially merged into the Kingdom of Great Britain. Anne was Protestant, Anne was legitimate, Anne was acceptable, but Anne had one catastrophic problem: she had no surviving heirs. And it wasn't for lack of trying. Over the course of her life, Anne endured 17 pregnancies. 17! Only one child survived infancy, and that child died at 11 years old. It's difficult to overstate how tragic this was, both personally and politically, because with Anne's health failing and no children to inherit the crown, Britain faced an existential question: who takes over when she dies? The obvious answer was Anne's closest relatives. Unfortunately, every single one of them was Catholic. The exiled Stuarts, descendants of the deposed James II, were waiting patiently in Europe, plotting their return with French support and papal blessings. And Britain absolutely refused to let that happen. In fact, when Parliament looked down the line of succession, the first 50 claimants were all Catholic. So, Parliament did something extraordinary. They skipped 53 people and went hunting for the nearest Protestant. That person was claimant number 54, an elderly German aristocrat named Sophia of Hanover. Sophia was in her 70s, lived in a small German state, and had absolutely no expectation of ruling Britain. But she was Protestant, descended from James I, and, most importantly, not Catholic. Parliament declared her the official heir to the British throne. Had she lived just 2 months longer, she would have become the oldest monarch ever to ascend it. Instead, Sophia died shortly before Queen Anne, and so the crown passed to her son, a 54-year-old German man named George Ludwig. Britain had just acquired a king who barely spoke English, had never lived in the country, and did not particularly want to be there.
George I's coronation was, by all accounts, deeply uncomfortable. The king didn't understand his own subjects, his subjects didn't understand him. He governed Britain the way someone manages an Airbnb they don't live in, minimally, reluctantly, and with frequent trips back home to Hanover. When he was in England, he brought along his German mistresses, whom the emerging British press gleefully nicknamed the Elephant and the Maypole. And yet, Britain tolerated him, because while he was foreign, aloof, and deeply uncharismatic, he had one critical quality: he wasn't Catholic. And that was enough. Thus began the Hanoverian dynasty, a line of thoroughly German kings who would rule Britain for nearly 2 centuries. Over time, they learned English, they adopted British customs, they slowly became more culturally British, but their dynastic politics remained deeply German. Every monarch from George I to Queen Victoria married a German spouse and simultaneously ruled the German state of Hanover. Even at the height of the British Empire, the royal household was conducting much of its private life in German, which brings us to the moment when this quiet foreignness suddenly became a massive problem. Queen Victoria presided over the largest empire the world had ever seen, and yet every night she spoke German with her husband, Prince Albert, who was also her cousin. Albert belonged to the spectacularly unmarketable German house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. When Victoria died in 1901, Britain didn't just lose a queen, it officially entered a new dynasty with a name that sounded less like royalty and more like a spell from a fantasy novel. For a while, this didn't matter. European royalty was basically one big interrelated family anyway. But then came 1914. World War I exploded across the continent, and Britain suddenly found itself at war with Germany. The British king, George V, was the first cousin of the German Kaiser. His dynasty was German, his surname was German, and German bombers, specifically Gotha bombers, were now dropping explosives on London. The optics were catastrophic. So in 1917, George V made a decision that would save the monarchy. He issued a royal proclamation declaring that his family would abandon its German name entirely. From that moment forward, they would be known as the House of Windsor, named after the castle. Relatives were ordered to anglicize their names as well. The Battenbergs became the Mountbattens. Titles were stripped, German honors discarded, even the language changed. It was a full-scale PR rebrand executed in the middle of a world war, and it worked flawlessly. The British public embraced the Windsors. They felt ancient, solid, national. While German monarchies collapsed one by one, Britain's survived. The irony is stunning. The most British royal family in modern history was in truth a German dynasty that understood optics better than anyone else in Europe. They didn't cling to the past, they adapted, they rebranded, and in doing so, they outlived nearly every rival monarchy on the continent. This story isn't really about bloodlines, it's about identity, about how nations tell stories about themselves. The Windsors didn't become British because of genetics, they became British because they understood what Britain needed to see: stability, familiarity, continuity. They wrapped themselves in symbols, language, and tradition until the origin story faded into the background. While their cousins lost thrones, fled into exile, or vanished into obscurity, the Windsors endured. They navigated revolutions, world wars, scandals, and media scrutiny by doing one thing extremely well: adjusting just enough to survive. And that may be the most British thing of all.
This is the part that really messes with your sense of history. The British royal family didn't survive because they were the strongest, the most righteous, or even the most beloved. They survived because they understood something far more important. Identity is not fixed, it is performed. The Hanoverians didn't cling stubbornly to who they were. They watched the world change, felt public sentiment turn against them, and quietly rewrote themselves to fit the moment. They learned which traditions mattered and which ones could be sacrificed. They wrapped themselves in symbolism, language, and ritual until the past became invisible beneath the performance. And over time, that performance stopped feeling like an act. It became reality. Most monarchies in Europe failed this test. They assumed blood alone would protect them. The Windsors understood that survival depended on perception. And that understanding, more than any crown or castle, is what kept them on the throne. Which leads us to one of history's greatest ironies. The most British royal family in living memory is also one of the least British by origin. While their German cousins lost their thrones, fled into exile, or vanished into footnotes, the Windsors endured because they adapted faster than the world could turn on them. They survived 2 world wars, the collapse of empires, relentless media scrutiny, and the slow erosion of royal authority by doing something deceptively simple. They changed just enough to remain familiar. They became symbols rather than rulers, stories rather than governors, and in doing so, they transformed the monarchy from a political institution into a cultural one. That shift saved them. Not strength, not tradition, not even popularity, just timing, optics, and an instinct for survival that most royal houses never developed. And that's why this story isn't really about Germany or Britain at all.
It's about people, about fear, uncertainty, and the desperate human need for stability after chaos. Britain didn't choose the Hanoverians because they were inspiring. It chose them because they were safe, Protestant, predictable, acceptable. Over time, familiarity turned into loyalty, and loyalty turned into myth. We like to imagine history as a series of grand plans and deliberate choices, but more often than not, it's a chain of accidents held together by people doing their best to avoid disaster. The British monarchy didn't survive because it was inevitable. It survived because at exactly the right moment, it made exactly the right compromises. So, the next time you see the British royal family waving from a balcony, draped in flags and tradition, remember this: beneath the pageantry lies one of the greatest identity makeovers in history. A foreign dynasty that didn't conquer Britain, but outlasted everyone else by learning how to belong. History isn't always shaped by those who fight the hardest. Sometimes it's shaped by those who know when to change their name, adjust their image, and quietly disappear into the story they want the world to remember. And if that feels unsettling, good, because history is rarely as simple as it looks from the outside. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. If history had gone slightly differently, if Queen Anne had lived a few more years, if Sophia of Hanover hadn't died when she did, if one religious line in Parliament's laws had been written another way, the British monarchy as we know it simply wouldn't exist. No Windsors, no Buckingham Palace balcony waves, no carefully choreographed tradition. What feels permanent today was once fragile, accidental, and deeply improvised. And yet, that fragility is exactly what shaped its survival. The monarchy didn't endure because it was unchangeable. It endured because it was flexible when it mattered most. That's the paradox at the heart of this story. The institutions that survive longest are often the ones willing to admit, quietly, that they are not as eternal as they pretend to be. And maybe that's the real reason this story still matters. Because beneath the crowns and castles, this isn't just about kings and queens. It's about how societies decide who belongs, how identities are built, and how power survives by reshaping itself rather than standing still. The Windsors didn't win history by force. They won it by understanding people, by becoming familiar when the world was afraid, stable when everything felt uncertain, and symbolic when authority itself began to fade. History doesn't always reward the strongest. Sometimes it rewards the ones who read the room best. And if that sounds uncomfortably modern, that's because it is. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And this rhyme is still echoing.